Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first ACA webinar presented by Beehive Insurance. We're glad to have everyone here on the call. Please note that you will be in listen-only mode and not being able to voice your questions, but we do have the option to have you type those into the question box. You will see on this screen where you can type that, and we'll be able to answer those throughout the webinar. Today we'll be having Laurie Keller as our presenter on our first ACA webinar, going over the ACA and who it applies to. We'll go ahead and turn the time over to Laurie to begin the presentation.
Hi everyone, we're really glad you could join us today. Today we are talking about the Affordable Care Act and what employers need to know. This is part of a 4-part series that we're doing Tuesdays and Thursdays this week and next. These are being recorded and they will be available afterwards, along with a simple handout that you can see over in your control panel. A very, very handy handout. It looks like this. And it has just a simple summary of some of the things we will be covering as far as what you should know regarding the ACA, what it asks of employers, and some of the acronyms we also use. So we hope you are able to use it and that you can refer back to it at any time. So you have that available to you now until we have the slides and recordings available. So today we are going to start with a summary of the employer mandate and who it applies to. And in our future webinars on Thursday, we'll be covering who is an eligible employee. On next week, on Tuesday, we'll be covering quality coverage, affordability, and the penalties. And then on Thursday, we'll be finishing up with using Employee Navigator to manage the Affordable Care Act. So we're really excited for this series. This is something we've wanted to do at Beehive for about 3 years now. And we have finally, with everything that has gone on, we finally have the availability to do it. So we're really excited that we're able to do this and present this for you to help you better understand what you as an employer, as an HR manager, what you need to know when ACA issues come up, or even if ACA is an issue for you. So let's begin. The reason we're starting off with who is a large employer is because this will help you understand if you have to comply or if you are able to stay small enough that you don't have to comply and you can avoid certain requirements of the ACA. So let's start by actually summarizing what the ACA is when it comes to employers. You can see we have a lovely bridge. So this is us building a bridge between the legalese of the ACA and what it actually means to us. So simply put, the ACA states that large companies have to offer quality coverage that is affordable to 95% or more of their eligible employees or pay a penalty. Now we all know it's not actually that simple. Each one of these terms has a specific definition. So in the case of large, it means an applicable large employer, or ALE. That's what we'll be covering today. So large companies have to be the ones that are complying. Some of the other terms that are very specifically defined in the employer mandate also include quality, as in quality coverage. This means minimum value. Affordable is set by the IRS, and it is a percentage of an employee's household income. And then eligible employees. They are employees who average 30 or more hours per week. The other 3 terms will be covered in future webinars, which we are really excited. We hope you are able to join us. Again, these will be recorded, but you guys being able to ask your questions is what is really going to help make this applicable for you, and so that we can address them. So please, if you are able to attend those, we would love to have you. So let's go over some acronyms we're going to be using in today's webinar. The first one, of course, is ACA for Affordable Care Act, ALE for Applicable Large Employer, FTE for Full-Time Equivalent. Notice that this is a full-time equivalent. This is a specific term used by the ACA. We also use FT for full-time or full-time employee. Note we are not using FTE for full-time employee. That is specifically full-time equivalent. We have part-time, PT, for part-time or part-time employee. We also use EE and ER for employee and employer as an abbreviation in some of our charts. So those are the acronyms we're going to be using today. The key difference is, again, the FTE for full-time equivalent. So let's go with our first question of who is an applicable large employer, because we know that applicable large employers have to comply. Simply, an applicable large employer is a company that had an average of 50 full-time equivalents during the last calendar year. Now keep in mind there are some exceptions for one-time bumps for large new companies. So now we have to say what's a full-time equivalent, because otherwise we can't count to that 50 requirement without knowing what a full-time equivalent is. So a full-time equivalent is someone who works 120 or more hours per month. This is about 27.5 hours per week. So if we have a small company with 7 employees, here's how we would calculate their full-time equivalent. So here we have our list of our employees, we have their class, and we have the monthly hours they worked in February, followed by their FTE status, their FTE count. So as you can see with Padme Amidala, she worked, and please forgive my pronunciation, tried to choose ones that I knew how to pronounce, but I am not a major Star Wars fan, so I apologize for anyone I may offend with that. So with Padme, you can see in February she worked 175 hours. Since the requirement is to work 120 hours, she has worked more than that, so her FTE is the equivalent of 1. So even though she worked more than 120 hours in February, she is not 1.5, she is not 1.25. Her equivalent is 1 for any employee that works more than 120 hours. If you go down to R2D2 and you see that he worked 85 hours, his FTE equivalent, or FTE count, is 85 divided by 120, or 0.71. If we go down to the bottom and look at Darth Vader and his hours of 215 hours in February, quite a lot, his equivalent, again, even though it is much larger than 120, it is the equivalent of 1. So because a single employee cannot have a FTE of more than 1, your FTE cannot exceed the number of employees you have. So since this company has 7 employees, their FTE cannot exceed 7 for this month. Their FTE actually ends up being less than 7 because they have quite a few people who are working less than 120 hours per month. So their count equivalent is 6.13, far below the 50 required to be an applicable large employer. Before we continue, are there any questions, Alicia, that we have received about counting FTEs or applicable large employers?
Nope, not yet.
Awesome. I hope everything's making sense. Again, if not, please ask your questions. So one note, when counting hours, you need to remember that an hour is any time that an employee is entitled to pay. So please include paid time off, paid sick leave, jury duty, etc. If you do happen to have an unusual pay type, such as per mile or piecework, please get with your account manager so you can figure out how you are supposed to be counting hours for your employees. So let's go on to an example for ALE counting. Remember, again, if you are not an ALE, then you don't need to comply with the ACA. So let's look at our company, ABC Book Company. They're a small company. They've been around for a little while. They publish and print a few books by local authors. However, in 2018, they only had 40 employees. And remember from the previous example of our Death Star employees, they only had 7, and their FTE count can never exceed the number of employees they had. So in 2018, Since ABC Book Company only had 40 employees, we know in 2018 that their FTE count was less than 40, which is less than the 50 required to be an ALE. So we know in 2018 that they weren't an ALE. However, in 2019, one of their books was featured in Oprah's Favorite Things. This is wonderful for business. This massive boost in sales allowed ABC Book Company to promote many part-time employees and hire new employees beginning in the summer of 2019. Now, I know that Oprah's Favorite Things does not actually come out in summer, but for this example, let's pretend it does. So let's ask some key questions about ABC Book Company. First, when do they become an ALE? Next, let's look at when do they need to start complying with the ACA? And also, when do they need to first file 1095 and 94 ACA forms? Each of these questions will have different answers based on what their employment is. So let's look at their FTE count for 2019. Here we go. So here we have a chart that we're going to go through step by step to do their FTE count for ABC Book Company. First, we're going to go month by month and see how many employees worked 120 or more hours in that month, because we know those employees will be worth exactly one full-time equivalent. So now that we've filled out our numbers for how many employees worked more than 120 hours in each month, you can see that there's a slight jump in August, but the real jump begins in September. Next, we're going to look at all of our employees who worked less than 120 hours per month. Today, we're going to call them our part-time employees. And we're going to count how many of them worked less. Again, you can see we had a slight jump beginning in June, July, August, but again, the big jumps and is towards the end of the year, September and October. Keep in mind that some employees may be moving from one month to another, where in January, you might have an employee who worked 120 hours per month, but in February, they jump down here and are counted in part of these because they only worked 100 hours that month. So we have some employees who are bouncing back and forth depending on the hours they worked. So now we're going to look at this part-time employees, and we're going to add up all of their hours for the month that they have worked less than 120 hours. So here are their hours. These employees are tending to work about 20 hours per week. And now to get the FTE count for our part-time employees, we're going to take their hours and divide by 120. So now we have taken our third row divided by 120. That gets our full-time equivalent for our part-time employees. And finally, we want our total full-time equivalent for each month. We're going to do this by adding our top row with our bottom row. Because again, all of our employees who worked 120 or more hours in a given month are worth one full-time equivalent. So here is our count. Now let's look at our questions. First, we need to know if we are an ALE before we need to know if we need to comply or report. So our first question is, what is the average full-time equivalent count for 2019? One error some people might make is they might look at this and say, well, January through July, the full-time equivalent is less than 50, and that's more than half the year. So the average is less than 50. But that's not true, and that's not how the IRS wants us to do the average. We are going to add up all 12 months and then divide by 12. So our average ends up being nearly 52. This is more than the 50 FTEs required to be an applicable large employer. So now we ask, when do they become an ALE? And the answer is in 2019. But when do they need to start complying with the ACA? because they don't need to start complying on January 1st. They didn't know they were going to have a large jump in employees. So there is a little bit of leeway, and they need to start complying January 1st, 2020. This allows employers to have time to know and look back on their old hours and their employees to see whether or not they were ALE. And lastly, when do they need to first file their 1095 and 94 ACA forms? They will be filing in 2021 for the 2020 calendar year. The IRS doesn't want you to file ahead of time, so we are always going to file after the year is finished. Have we had any questions about this particular full-time equivalent count example?
Nothing has come in yet. Go ahead and put any questions out there, guys, if you have them.
Yep. And if not, then I'm really glad that this is making sense and is helping. And again, also, if you have specific questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to us or your account manager. We would love to hear them and be able to address them for you so that you can fully understand your job and how it applies to the ACA. Let's go through another example. This is a seasonal example. So we have skipped a few steps in our FTE counting. We have just counted all of our employees who worked 120 or more hours in a month, and we have counted our part-time, full-time equivalent count. You will notice that there is a absolutely massive jump in December. We have hired a lot of part-time employees. Over the entire year, though, this company averages 54.66 full-time equivalents. But there's that bump over the last 2 months. So it's only over the last 2 months currently that they have more than 50 full-time equivalents. So because there is just that bump and it is just over those last 2 months, special rules may apply. So due to the number of hours the part-time employees work, they are probably an ALE, but again, the special rules may apply. They will only apply if this employer only has a count greater than 50 for less than 120 days. So it really depends on what happens in January and February of the next year. And it ends up getting a little bit complicated. But we can see how some employers may encounter this, especially during the December holiday season with Black Friday sales and everything else that happens. So they may have an exception and they may not be considered an ALE, even though their average for 2019 is greater than 50. But again, if you find yourself in this situation, please discuss this with your account manager. So we have some additional ALE notes for employers that you should be aware of. One of them is if you have sister companies, they may be counted as one for the purposes of the ACA. This prevents some abuse from employers. So, for example, we have Jane's Cookies and Maria's Bakery. They are co-owned by the same people. On their own, Jane's Cookies only has 35 full-time equivalents, and Maria's Bakery has 20 full-time equivalents. However, since they are co-owned, together they have 55 full-time equivalents, and they are considered an ALE. This is considered an ALE group. So employers, it is important for you to let us know if you happen to have co-ownership with another company, or if one of your owners happens to have co-ownership, because we do need to count all of your full-time equivalents together. Simply, this prevents companies with common ownership from splitting up their workforce to avoid complying with the ACA. So Jane couldn't hire an employee and then have that employee move over to Maria's Bakery and end up working there. That employee would still be considered working under one company for the ACA. You do need to discuss common ownership with your account manager. So please bring that up. The other exception that we mentioned earlier was if you knew you were going to be large. So going back to our ALE slide. So some exceptions for one-time bumps, which we did go over, and also large new companies. When we say large new companies, that means if you start out as, so let's say you are a company, you're brand new, and you know you're going to start off by hiring 70 full-time employees. If you start out knowing that you're going to have 70 full-time employees, then you need to start out complying with the ACA. The same goes with if you are suddenly going to acquire a large new company. If you know you're suddenly going to be large, you need to start complying with the ACA.
Lauren, we do have a question right now that I think would be valid for everyone to hear. And the question is and this was a couple of slides back, but on the previous slide, you said that they have to start complying with the ACA in 2020 because of numbers in 2019, and they'd have to file their 1094, 1095s in 2021 for the year 2020. But what happens if they drop below 50 FTEs in 2020?
That is an excellent question. They are still going to be considered an applicable large employer for that year. If they drop below 50, if they drop drastically below 50 full-time employees in 2020, they may find that they won't experience any penalties depending on the number of eligible employees, and that will be covered slightly more in depth in our third webinar on next Tuesday. So they may find that they have no penalty for that, and we do recommend, so please attend our third webinar. So it is, they do have to comply, but they may find that the penalty ends up being $0 or ends up being rather small.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that helps. So we have made sure to keep our webinars nice, short, and sweet. We didn't want to completely take up everybody's time. So, regarding that question, it does mean for the following year. So if in 2019 they have more than 50, then they comply in 2020, which they may find that they don't have a penalty. But if they drop below 50 in 2020, then they don't have to comply in 2021. So there can be some jumping back and forth, especially for a mid-size employer. So that's an excellent reason to keep track of your employees, make sure that you're tracking hours of your full-time equivalents so that you know when you have to report. An Employee Navigator does have some great resources for tracking your employees, making sure you have an accurate ALE count or full-time equivalent count, so you know when you do and don't have to comply with the ACA. But we will go over more on calculating the penalties and using Employee Navigator with tracking everything next week. So we will have soon our previous webinars, including this one. They will be uploaded to the Beehive Insurance blog. And soon we're going to have even more webinars coming up at our go-to stage/channel/beehive-insurance. We're really excited for those. So please ask any final questions. Again, each of these webinars we are trying to keep short and sweet so that there's plenty of time for questions. There's plenty of time to address any issues that come up, and also time so that you can get back to what you're doing and enjoy the rest of your day. So do we have any final questions that we should address before we sign off and let everybody continue with their day?
It looks like that is the only question we've had, and nothing else is coming in yet. Obviously, if you have any questions after this webinar, please feel free to reach out to your specific account manager, and we're happy to answer anything else that might come up.
All right.
Everybody attending.
Yep. Thanks for coming. We do have our next webinar will be on Thursday. We'll be covering who is an eligible employee. So you can, again, view and register for the webinars using the go-to stage link. We're excited for it. We will have the webinar and slides available soon. This was recorded, And also, please keep in mind that this is not legal or tax advice, but as Beehive Insurance, as one of our clients, you do have access to some wonderful resources. We have some amazing partners who can give anything from legal advice to HR assistance. So please, if you have questions or you just need to know what is available to you as a client or as a potential client, we would love to give you some of those resources. So please reach out. We're excited for this webinar series. We hope it helps so that people can better understand the Affordable Care Act. So thank you for attending.
Thanks, everyone.